This episode of Trifles is brought to you by the Baker Street Journal, the leading publication of Sherlockian scholarship since 1946. Find them online at bakerstreetirregulars.com. Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, there were men that were dancing, creeping, and crooked, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? What's a tantalus? Or a gasogene? And what's the difference between a hansom cab and a four-wheeler?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 169, Loneliness and Isolation in the Canon. Hello and welcome once again to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we look into some of the minutiae in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
And I'm Burt Wolder.
And we are delighted to be with you here today. We are recording this episode, of course, but we're also broadcasting it live on YouTube and Facebook. Our first time ever for trying this. And the reason we're doing this is because it has become apparent that many people are sheltering in place because of the COVID-19 pandemic, and there are cases where people can become quite lonely, isolated, and perhaps even depressed. And we thought we might run this little show just to interrupt your day for a bit and to provide a little entertainment and to keep us all connected. So that's why we are here. If you are listening to this as a recording, you can find the show notes at ihose.co/trifles169. And of course, you can follow us on social media on YouTube, now, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, where we are I Hear of Sherlock. And if you have it in your hearts, if you'd like to help support the show, you can go to our Patreon page, which you can reach off of SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Find us on Patreon there and donate. $1 a month is as little as it costs, or you can give whatever you want. But all of your donations go directly to supporting the show here. We have costs like streaming. We've paid for the branding now on StreamYard, so you see this neato banner coming up, and it allows us to distribute the show to folks. So anything that you can give would help. Just go to our homepage, SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. and make that donation. We will be taking questions from you. We'll be taking questions and comments in the second half of the show, but Burt and I wanted to kick it off right now by beginning the discussion about who are some of the people in the Sherlock Holmes stories that we come across who happen to be lonely or isolated in some way. And Burt, because I'm in a giving spirit, I thought, well, I'd allow you to start the conversation here. Who are some of the lonely people that we know in the Sherlock Holmes stories, and why are they lonely?
Well, that's a terrific question for which I don't have a terribly detailed answer. I mean, when I think about loneliness in the Sherlock Holmes stories, the first person I think about is Sherlock Holmes, who we will find eventually. This is one of the few things that I looked up earlier. In The Lion's Mane, we do have a reference to Holmes in retirement in supposedly his own words. And after a couple of paragraphs where he describes his villa and so on, he says, interestingly enough, he says, my house is lonely. But that's kind of it. I mean, and when you look at what goes on in The Lion's Mane, you find that there's, even in the far reaches of Holmes's retirement, there's no shortage of people popping around the neighborhood, and he has his housekeeper. But Holmes is someone who I don't know. When I think about Holmes, I think he may have had congenital loneliness because he wasn't the easiest person to be around. And so we know how he amuses himself because there are lots of points in the canon where he and Watson are we've talked about this, over the last few episodes because of the weather. They're stuck in the house. So he has his chemical table, and our pal Chris Zordan has written, I think, about what kind of experiments Holmes might have had. Okay, so Holmes has his chemical table, and we know that he does experiments he's also does things like explore the motets of Lassus. He engages in target practice. He sometimes takes cocaine. He updates his indexes. He reads. We don't know a lot about what he reads, but he's familiar with Horace and Hafiz and Winwood Reade. And music. He amuses himself with his violin and on the phonograph and so on. So there's a start, Sherlock Holmes.
I think that's a great start. There's another section, and he's not yet retired yet, in The Adventure of the Mazarin Stone, where, of course, this is that famous narration, that third-party narration. It was pleasant to Dr. Watson to find himself once more in the untidy room of the first floor of Baker Street, which had been the starting point of so many remarkable adventures. He looked round him at the scientific charts upon the wall, the acid-charred bench of chemicals, the violin case leaning in the corner, the coal scuttle which contained of old the pipes and tobacco. Finally, his eyes came round to the fresh and smiling face of Billy, the young but very wise and tactful page who had helped fill up the gap of loneliness and isolation which surrounded the saturnine figure of the great detective. So we remember when Holmes is reminiscing in one of his cases about Watson leaving him for a wife, the only selfish thing that he remembered. This could have very well been the case that Holmes knew. He told us in A Study in Scarlet that he got into fits of great depression from time to time. So Holmes probably knew that he was subject to this type of loneliness and isolation and did appear to prefer having people around him, if for nothing more than to validate his thoughts, to whom he could show off in some cases and use them as an outlet for his intellectual pursuits. Remember, he always said that his mind was like a racing engine. If it's not hooked up to the work with which it's supposed to be doing, it will crack itself to pieces. And having a companion there, someone to share his thoughts, to share his intuition with, was one way to do that.
Absolutely. Although I find it hard to believe that Holmes ever turned to Billy and said, Billy, if this solution turns blue, it means a man's life.
And Billy would go, I'll get the door, sir.
Billy would go, you talking to me? Right.
Oh, that's great. Yeah.
Well, that's true. And then there's Watson. We know Watson describes himself early on as not the most sociable person in the world and finds himself when he comes to London without a friend. And that's why Mike Derda and other people have called the cases of Sherlock Holmes as the stories of the world's first consulting detective and his only friend. But we know that when Watson has some time on his hands, he reads yellowback novels and the sea stories of
Clark Russell,
whoever that writer, Clark Russell, and goes and plays billiards with Thurston at least once. So he's a little bit more sociable.
That's true.
But this whole question about loneliness in the canon, we do see some other evidences of it. I mean, we hadn't talked about this, but when I think of loneliness in the canon, I think about people like Nathan Garadeb.
Oh. And
Garadeb, and clearly here's somebody who is so in his own circle or in his own process or whatever's going on with Nathan Garadeb that he rarely gets out of the house, which is one of the reasons why his presence at home becomes an issue. But he has, like many Victorians, this collection. He's collected, Holmes says, something like old bones and all kinds of stuff, lots of stuff but nothing of particular value, has his little cabinet of curiosities. And that's a characteristic, I think, of certainly English society at a certain point. I mean, when you go to Britain and walk around, you'll eventually bump into Sloane Square, and Sloane Square, is named after Hans Sloane, who was the founder of the British Museum. And it was Sloane who, I guess in the 17th century, was beavering around cataloging plants and animals and things. And, in the same way, what's his name? Ashmole. How the library at Oxford, the Ashmolean, is named after another 17th century fellow who was busy cataloging things, although I think Ashmole collected manuscripts and so on. So collecting, cataloging, natural history, this is very much aligned with Holmes, who was a great observer of what we like to call trifles, but of course, natural science in a way, evidence and things. So this is part of amusing yourself by cataloging the world is sort of the characteristic of it.
That's just it. I think it's important for all of us to have some kind of hobby, some kind of outlet through which we can either share with others, much like we do here, or simply take some time in isolation and enjoy ourselves. And the thing there is there's a bit of a dichotomy there. I think yes, you can immerse yourself in that kind of study and in whatever it is that you're passionate about, but at the same time, being immersed in that kind of a bubble, being so isolated from the rest of society or from great swaths of society, can build misinformation. It can build gullibility in some cases if you don't know exactly what to expect. That's a great example of even Jabez Wilson, much like Nathan Garadeb. He was busy running a shop, right? He was there isolated in his shop day to day, and of course customers would come in. But when someone came in with this fanciful tale that, there was a lottery basically, and Jabez Wilson was the winner, well, of course he'd be predisposed to want to believe that. Day after day opening his shop and maybe selling a couple of things. That kind of isolation can build, again, misinformation. And I think staying in touch with each other in this particular time as we are, and you can do it via video, you can do it via letter writing. I think there's going to be a whole swath of letter writing that comes back to us. And I do want to get to letter writing with respect to isolation, because that leads us directly into the red circle.
Right.
You think about Amelia Luca, who was shut up in Mrs. Warren's boarding house there for personal safety, certainly. And the only way she had to communicate with Mrs. Warren was by writing a word down. One at a time, she would leave a word on her tray. So this is a woman who was isolated by, she was physically isolated, but she was also isolated by virtue of the language. She spoke only Italian or very poor English and was using words that she could find in the newspaper to help satisfy her wants.
It's a great example. Loneliness really was the common characteristic of life. I recall years ago living in a little town, getting to know my neighbors who were older, much older, and realized in conversation with them that they had never been anywhere beyond sort of a 50-mile radius of where they lived. And it's not everybody who's like Shakespeare, and who goes from Stratford to London. There are people who just keep in their own particular orbit. But thankfully, all that is gone now that we have the internet, Facebook, and social media.
And here we are. Well, let's use this opportunity to take a quick word from our sponsor, and when we come back, we'll get to some of your comments and questions that we see popping up in our Facebook page. So stay tuned. It is always a pleasure to receive the Baker Street Journal in the mail. It comes not 4, but 5 times a year. Your 4 seasonal quarterlies plus the Christmas annual. And each time it is a welcome sight. That envelope arriving, tearing it open, seeing the yellow-backed cover, and the cover art in recent years has been changing each time. the publishers are keeping us on our toes. And of course, the content inside is no less exciting. You don't get too much on repeat with the Baker Street Journal, although you will see responses to various articles by other authors. But it is a lovely way to stay in touch with the Sherlockian world and to understand the things that are on people's minds and the things that are worth discussing. Check it out at bakerstreetirregulars.com and make sure you subscribe today. Okay, always nice to hear from our friends at the Baker Street Journal. We are back and we are ready to discuss some of your comments and questions. They have been flowing in, so I do appreciate that. We've got folks who are introverts and extroverts, and I think this very rightly kind of shows the divide with how people decide to handle their individual situations, whether they're in the canon or not. But another woman who comes up who was very lonely, and I lost who mentioned this to us, is Eugenia Ronder. This, of course, comes to us from The Veiled Lodger, one of the later cases, but it's probably the ultimate story in loneliness. This is a woman who self-isolated after she was horribly injured and disfigured by a circus accident. We won't give too much away. And Holmes went to talk with her. And in some ways, her case was not necessarily the solving of a mystery, although it was determining who she was and why she was veiled. That was what we were after in that story, in as much as it was a confessional of sorts. You know, we've talked about this on a number of shows before, that so many of the characters in the canon are tragic figures. They have incredibly sad stories or questionable endings. We don't know how life goes on after them. It's not always a happy ending, but for the reader's perspective, it makes great sense because it's a definite conclusion to what we were looking for. And with Eugenia Ronder, here is a woman who decided to self-isolate after those many years and, in fact, was questioning her worth on this earth. And Holmes reminded her at the very end that her life is not her own, and that if she were ever tempted to take it, that she should approach him for assistance.
Yeah, it's a very good example. Lonely. I mean, there are so many negative. I don't know how many. Well, I guess there are a great number of tragic figures in the canon. That's true. We have talked about that. But loneliness, has a profoundly negative set of characteristics. I think of Violet Hunter, who goes back to her flat after this poor interview at Westaways and sees the bills that are due and realizes that she's sort of at the end of her tether. So, that is. And these sorts of desperate moments do characterize lots of people who have worked themselves into nervous apoplexy or other things, before they consult Sherlock Holmes.
Yeah. Well, and I lost, apologies, I lost who exactly said this because the comments they're getting squished down here for me, but someone mentioned that Holmes himself was isolated or nearly isolated for 3 years. During the Great Hiatus. He immediately fled after the interaction with Professor Moriarty at the Reichenbach Falls. A week later, he found himself in Florence, and over the next 3 years, he went all the way to Tibet, and then through Mecca, and eventually back through France, and made his way to London. So, in doing so, he could not have had companionship of any meaningful sort, even though he may have spent time with the Lama, 1L, not 2, remember that. He was traveling alone and had to maintain his disguise. Of course, he was known as Sigerson during the time, rather than really give away his secret to many folks.
Yep. Yeah, that was Bob Katz, who I think I'm not really seeing all of the comments coming in, but I did see This one from Bob Katz, who pointed out that Lindsay, our friend Lindsay Fay, wrote about this in her essay in the manuscript series.
Yeah, I'm just grabbing it off the shelf right now.
Uh-huh.
Folks watching live can see me. You can't see this if you're on video. I just grabbed Out of the Abyss from our friends at the BSI Press.
Oh.
Not our advertiser this time around, but they do make their way to us from time to time. And Lindsay Fay wrote an essay called An Empty House on page 157 here. It's been a while since I've read this. And Bob, thank you for bringing that back to our attention. And the way Lindsay wrote this was as an excerpt from the diary of Dr. Watson in early 1894. And again, Watson himself mentions when Holmes comes back that he was suffering from his own great bereavement. And we're meant to infer that that means the loss of his wife, who of course would have been Mary Morstan at the time, Mary Morstan Watson. So Watson himself would have been enduring a certain kind of loneliness and isolation, having gone from having a fairly steady roommate / companion from 1881 on, and then of course leaving Holmes for marriage, and then losing his next companion. So of course we can understand that Watson, who himself was lonely when he got back from India in A Study in Scarlet, of course looking for companionship at that point. So I think, we started by mentioning the loneliness of Sherlock Holmes, but Watson himself was not a stranger to isolation and loneliness.
Yes, absolutely. And there are, it's now that I think about this, you really find it's difficult to open up the canon and look at a character that doesn't have some connection to loneliness and isolation. And I just opened up a book, and what did I see? I saw the 5 Orange Pips. So there you've got a bunch of Openshaws who are, let's put it this way, their lives are disrupted when they get envelopes of orange pips because they're being pursued. And then, of course, you've got the Sholtos and the people who've committed crimes and who are worried about discovery. And, there are very few people who, in the canon, who've created a new identity for themselves who don't later on have some difficulty about it.
Yeah. I want to turn to a couple of medical cases, or one medical case and one, I guess we could call it a medical case because it's probably more psychological in nature, of isolation and quarantine. Mary Alcaro mentions poor Godfrey Emsworth, who of course was in The Blanched Soldier. Lonely in quarantine, right? That was an actual quarantine in the canon. We mentioned infectious diseases a few episodes ago. Well, this is right in line with that. And Claire Thomas mentions the resident patient, who she thinks was lonely with only his paranoia and money for company. I think that's another great one. Can you imagine living, 20 years beyond your crime, and not being able to share with anyone exactly who you were or why you were afraid? And of course, that's exactly why he invited Dr. Percy Trevelyan to join him as his resident physician, as he himself was the resident patient.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Well, I'm sure we could go on, and maybe we should make this some kind of a regular thing here on Trifles, notwithstanding all of our technical challenges. What we're going to do now is we're going to close the official show that will go into the recording can, but we'll remain here on video to continue to chat with you guys and take some questions and feedback. So, if anything, this has not been a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You take my breath away, Mr. Holmes. How do you know that?
I followed you.
I saw no one.
That is what you may expect to see when I follow you.